Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. Lola's on assignment today, so I am taking a solo turn behind the mic, but I'm absolutely thrilled to have with me Patrick Obath. Patrick, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm excited as well to be able to participate today.
Patrick, could you tell our audience about your professional background and your current role?
Professionally, I'm a mechanical engineer. I worked in the oil industry for about 35 years. And then after that, rising to the level of CEO of Shell in East Africa. And then after that, I retired. But during that time, I got involved with the business management organizations, membership organizations, and I became the chairman of one called the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, which is KEPSA. And what we do is primarily to be advocates for the business associations in the country. We are not a business association ourselves, we are an apex body. So all the professional associations, the sector associations and so forth are members of KEPSA. And we work with government as a single entry point, and that has really helped us to shape the discussion around what happens for business in the country in Kenya. I finished that about 9 years ago when I finished my chairmanship of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. And since then, I'm involved in the business community on boards I'm the chairman of a few large companies, listed and unlisted. I'm a coach. I'm a leadership coach and recently started farming. So that's me.
I'm an ex Halliburton employee, and I did contracts all over the world, including Shell Nigeria. So I'm sure I
All
did a
right.
contract for you along the way. The other thing that just strikes me about your current sort of post Shell career is you talk three or four times at least about the private sector and businesses, even up to your leadership. And at the end, I'm going to ask you about leadership because that's something that I saw at Halliburton where companies could make a real difference by bringing leadership training to countries. And so I'm going to kind of work back to that because I think that's incredibly significant that now you're able to give back literally at that level to train a new generation of leaders. But how have you helped organizations with financing and corporate governance issues? Because if I want to come make an investment, if I want to come partner with a company, I'm going to look at corporate governance, certainly, but they're going to be looking at financing. How do you help either unbundle or put those together?
There are two key things that we look at, especially looking at Kenya. One, the country has got a reputation. And what we do is we get under the tradition and begin to unlock the different facets that will make it easier for an investor in the country to understand what the country is like. So people say, oh, Kenya is corrupt. We say, yes, Kenya may be perceived to be corrupt, but you can still get along and do business in the country by doing X, Y, and Z. Like, for example, we say, if you associate yourself with companies that are helping you, which are known to be sticklers for governance and integrity, then people say, no, don't try and do monkey business with a particular company, right? So we work to try and make sure that when people are coming in to invest, we ensure that they work with the right kind of partners who will help them put the investment together. And issues like corporate governance and so forth, we make sure that all of that is in place. And then when you talk about financing, the ability to recoup on your investments is key. And some of the key things that we look at in our country is we look at the regulations and the laws that the government has put up. And we work with the government to say this one is not going to be good for people who want to invest in this country. So we have that dialogue with the government, and we've been pushing a lot on things, what I call policy certainty. Because the worst thing that happens to a company wanting to invest in Kenya is to say, so if the policy changes halfway through, it means that probably your financial models, all those kind of things will actually be a problem because the tax regime has changed and has changed drastically just because the government has got something they want to do. So we have that conversation with government all the time in terms of ensuring that the terms that people find are conducive to investment and conducive to them getting financing, especially on policy certainty. We do work on that as part of our strategy of engagement for government to make it good for business.
I'm going to ask you about the role of business integrity in this area, but I want to preface it with a word you used in your prior answer, and that was actually a phrase, the perception of corruption, because it's not corruption, it's the perception of corruption. And I think you're absolutely spot on to say the perception, number one. And number two, you also spoke about how you could differentiate yourself as a business by not meeting that perception, by actually going the other way. And you use the word no monkey business with this company. I
Right.
see business integrity as potentially a business differentiator for countries, rather companies in Kenya or other areas. How would you kind of assess the perception of business integrity and then moving that forward?
What we do with the businesses that we work with is that we talk continuously about ethical behavior whenever you're seen in public, and your engagement with government, and your engagement with other companies. And it starts off with the statement within the company that you've got a policy and we're going to stick to it. And then whenever things go wrong and you have to self-correct internally, you make it known you've self-corrected. We've got a couple of companies in the country where people are actually relieved of their jobs because of unethical behavior or lack of integrity when they work. And that company says, we got rid of, we lost X number of employees during the course of the year. And out of the 20 employees that left, 8 of them were fired or left because of unethical behavior or integrity issues that they had. And when you talk about that, people begin to listen and understand that as a company, you are actually, your corporate governance and your integrity is handled at the highest level. So talking about it for us is key. If you do something, let the world know about it. And when the world knows about it, then you begin to build up this reputation, not only from amongst your peers, but also from the institutions that you work with, the government, other private sector organizations, banks, you're talking about NGOs, religious organizations, everything else. You become a go-to partner when those kind of things happen. But it takes a brave CEO, it takes a brave board, it takes a brave company to start talking about the fact that they got rid of people because of unethical behavior. People think that then the company is considered unethical. We believe no. If you do that, people will see you in a completely different light. And then the second thing is around the fact that people will then know that you continuously scan the environment, and you're talking about regulations and ensuring that the regulations that are put out by the government, by different people, are all such that they are not in themselves creating an opportunity for corruption. Because that's another way that you call policy corruption comes in the way regulations are put together. And companies that sort of talk about that are also perceived in a different way. So I could go on and on because it's something that I'm really passionate about, but those are the two that I think are important.
I'm really sorry for those who are listening to this podcast on our audio as opposed to perhaps watching it on Facebook, because the passion Patrick brought with that last answer really was something to behold. Kudos. And that really leads to the next area I wanted to explore with you, Patrick, which is compliance. Obviously, in the United States, we have a robust compliance framework, whether it's the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, whether it's some other framework that we in the United States have to comply with. How do you assess how Kenyan companies or even emerging market companies should look at compliance so that they can do business with the European companies or Western companies or other companies?
I think the best thing to do is actually to advocate for the adoption of those standards in your own country. We, in fact, wrote the Anti-Bribery Act as a private sector in Kenya. And we went to the OECD guidelines, we went to the anti-corruption laws in the UK and in the US, and we put all that together, got a team into a room, pressure cooker working, got the legislation drafted, and then gave it to the Attorney General and said, listen, as a private sector, we would like you as government to put this out as the Anti-Bribery Act in the country. And it's now operational in the country, and it deals primarily with the supply side. And the supply side is the private sector a lot of the times. So we made sure that as a private sector, we were seen to be leading in that area. And recently, with the help of SIPE, thank you very much, we also put out a simple guideline to the Anti-Bribery Act in Kenya, which we are sharing with companies free of charge through that support, so that anybody who is starting a business, whether it's an SME, a small company, or a large one that needs a very quick, a rough and ready guide as to what to do, they have available this guideline that we actually launched in December last year. So from the point of view of strengthening it, we've been proactive. And I think we'd like to ask that all the private sector companies who are coming to work in Africa work with the business management organizations in those countries and the membership organizations and push them to enact legislation that then they can work with and make sure that they're not operating in an environment that is silent on corruption. They operate in an environment that has got the legislation. And once you've got that, you can begin to push the envelope a lot more.
Once again, let me pick up on something you said, and that was you said you put everyone in a room, you put a pressure cooker on them, and you came out with at least a proposed form of legislation. And I want to not contrast that, compare that with the 2012 FCPA Resource Guide was a 500-page book put out by the Department of Justice and Securities and Exchange Commission talking about FCPA. And I asked one of the key authors of that, how did you do this? She said, we got in a room and everybody sat down and started writing. And that sounds like what you did. But what I want to say even further is that's what we had to do in college. There's no magic to this. It's just people sitting down with that pressure cooker and having to do it. There's no magic to this. It's just hard work, but it's skills we learned literally, in my case, 50 years ago or 40 years ago in college. So if you don't have one, you can do it too.
Yes.
We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted, and what we touched on was making how integrity efforts can make companies more attractive for investment. I've tried to look at it from the emerging market company perspective, which will make them perhaps a better candidate or more attractive, or as I say, a market differentiator if they truly do business with integrity. But from the US, UK, or other country perspective, is it, or I guess a couple of things. One, a better chance for a return on their investment. But number two, they want to be associated with businesses that work with integrity. Could you say a few words about both the inbound and outbound benefits to doing business in emerging markets with companies that do business with integrity?
I think there is a value, there is a business imperative in terms of working together as companies that are working with integrity. First of all, just the sheer cost of corruption is removed, because that costs, and it costs serious money. And it not only costs money in terms of the cash that is changing hands, but also in reputation. And if you lose that reputation, it means business may go past you. Even corrupt people, right, always try and look for non-corrupt companies to say we're working with companies that are of integrity. And then they come and try and corrupt you, right? That's how they work. But if you're seen as a company that is a company of very strong integrity, several things will happen. One, people will want to be associated with you because of the label that you carry, which means that you will get better business. We also do things like linking companies that have adopted certain integrity issues within the private sector. And we know that if they work together, their costs to each other of doing business are lower than companies that do not have integrity and compliance as part of the DNA. So when you're looking for a partner who is a company that is working with integrity, a company that has got good compliance, the issues around putting checks, balances, you name it, all those things, those costs will be reduced. And therefore, you will have a much better business relationship between the two of you that costs you less. And I mean, in my working days, clearing stuff from the port, our clearing agents used to say we have to pay the customs this, we have to do this, we have to do all those things. And we said, we don't work that way. And if that's what you want to do, please, we are going to get somebody else. It took us 3 attempts to get a company that was willing to walk the way we did. And eventually, we started importing things cheaper because we didn't have to pay a fee to a company where the costs of corruption were embedded in the fees they were charging us. So we talk about integrity and compliance being an opportunity for reducing costs in the company. And if you work with companies, inbound or outbound, as the case may be, that are doing that, you can be sure that you will be onto a very beneficial relationship as companies.
Patrick, I want to now sort of circle back to leadership. And I want to
Okay.
introduce it with the following. In sometime 2007, 2008, Halliburton started getting requests from national oil companies in Africa to train local uh, employees to be business partners. Part of the training was in the technical aspects, and you as a mechanical engineer would appreciate that. But part of the training was also to train local folks to move into leadership positions. And so there was this huge internal debate at Halliburton. Should we do this? Is this our mission? And myself and others said, not only should we train people, number one, they'll be more technically competent. Two, they'll understand how we do business. But number three, we'll be able to talk about our values. And it's not that we're telling them what to do, it's that we're giving them information that then they would become literally ambassadors for all of those things. And now this was almost 20 years ago, or at least 15 years ago. And many of those people now have risen up, as you did, through the industry. And I wanted you to maybe give us some of your thoughts on the role of a Western company to provide that type of training and how beneficial it can be for both parties, both of the people who receive the training, but also for the Western companies in terms of creating people who have the values of doing business integrity, doing business technically in a very efficient way, and also really not setting a standard for developing individual relationships with people like you were able to do. And now, and then we're going to end it with your current role in really leadership coaching. So I know that's a huge question, but I haven't found anyone I could ask that to yet. So you're it.
Yeah, okay. I think there's been a gradual change in terms of the way leadership is inculcated in the new managers and people that are coming up in Africa. In a lot of the emerging markets now, the methods that we use for first of all, for identifying leaders and then bringing them into companies and so forth have changed. And it's all from the learning from the lessons that you talk about from the early days when we had to sort of get set into place processes that actually ensure that we get people who have got leadership potential, but also with the right kind set of values. So you're finding now that a lot more of the recruitment and training of leaders is done using methods that have been tried and tested across the world, including the ones that Halliburton brought into their partners in Africa and other organizations, Shell, ExxonMobil, you name it, Unilever, etc., etc. All these companies, whilst they were seen as multinationals that are coming into to sort of exploit Africa and everything else at that time, there's a lot of good that they did in terms of resetting the way leadership was being taught and being assimilated in in our markets. And you find that now we have a lot of people who came out of that school many years ago who are now gurus within the countries on leadership and on several types of leadership. And my big one is servant leadership. And also in terms of the values that a leader should live so that they can inculcate that into the people that they're leading. One of the things that we talk around with our leaders is that whatever you don't just tell people to do as you tell them, they've actually got to see it in action and then believe it at the end of it, that they can actually benefit from having leaders who live to very high standards of integrity and whose value system is such that they are people who you can work with, they respect you, and they give you the space to work, etc., etc. All those good things that you're looking about in leadership. So there is the value that really a lot of the emerging markets have got from the original training that was brought about by the large multinationals that were coming through. I was a beneficiary of one of those, and I went through the sort of the Shell School of Hard Knocks, where they put you through these situations that are testing you continuously, including the fact that when we set up our whistleblower policy as a company, some mischievous people decided they wanted me out because of my stand of integrity. So they sort of sent in a whistleblowing thing saying that as a leader, you've been bribed by one of your people on this case and that case. So I stood down, and they did the investigation, found nothing. And I came back and said, guys, that is what whistleblowing is all about. It's supposed to hold us to account as leaders. And when you think there's something wrong, say it. We will step out. And if there's nothing found, and I was confident that they were not going to find anything, but I went through the process to prove that it actually works and people should believe in it. So I think that training is absolutely crucial for us to be able to lead the way in our area.
Patrick, I want to end by asking you, what are two or three of the big issues, or one or two of the maybe big issues you see in 2025 to 20 or down the road for business integrity in Kenya and emerging markets in Western Africa?
I think the key things that will be important to us as business leaders in those areas of integrity is being steadfast to the regulations and rules that have been put in by all the countries. Every country in the African continent has got some level or degree of anti-corruption regulations. We've got very great constitutions that talk about accountability. We've got governance requirements, and over the next 3 to 5 years, the leadership of business in the African region are the ones who will be leading the crusade to adopt those standards and make sure that not only is it in the private sector, but also in the public sector that those things are done. And we will be having a lot more dialogue with governments and public sector in terms of saying, let us work together to try and uproot corruption, and also build integrity into the way that we relate, and then ensure that we have common systems that we work with that embed the integrity and the compliance that we need to be able to minimize the cost of doing business between the private sector who are doing business and the government who are managing policy that makes business work. And that, I think, is going to be a recurrent theme over the next 3 to 5 years for us in the African continent.
Patrick, now we are unfortunately at the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted more information on yourself or really any of the topics you've touched on or your leadership coaching, what might be the best place or places for them to go?
They can go to two places. One is to go to the website of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, which is, you can visit our website, which is http://kepsa.or.oe. So you just look up kepsa.or.oe and you can get a lot of information about what I've talked about. Or you can just contact me directly, pobath@gmail.com, and I can start a conversation and also point you in the right direction within our country or some of the neighboring countries if you're interested to find out more around what we're doing in terms of making the environment for business better.
Patrick, I wanted to thank you again, and I greatly hope we can continue this conversation.
Yes, I'll be happy to have another session because this is part of my passion since I stopped working formally 8 to 5.